Hey everyone, welcome to Reddit at Work, where we dive into the real workplace stories that had people reaching for the popcorn or hiding behind their monitors. The no birthday celebrations rule, because cake was too distracting. It was a Tuesday morning, and the office was buzzing with its usual hum of keyboards clacking, phones ringing, and the occasional groan of someone realizing they'd forgotten to save their work before their computer decided to update itself. I was sipping my third cup of coffee, trying to summon the energy to tackle a particularly tedious spreadsheet, when our manager, Karen, called an impromptu team meeting. Karen was the kind of manager who loved meetings. She thrived on them. If she could have called a meeting to discuss the agenda for another meeting, she would have. So, when she gathered us in the conference room, we all assumed it was just another routine update about quarterly goals or the new printer policy, which, by the way, was already a source of endless frustration because it required a 12-step authentication process just to print a single page. But this meeting was different. Karen stood at the front of the room, her arms crossed, her face a mask of solemnity. She looked like she was about to deliver news of her impending apocalypse. "Team," she began, her voice low and serious, "we need to address a growing issue in the office. It's come to my attention that birthday celebrations have become disruptive." There was a collective pause as we all processed this. Disruptive? Birthday celebrations? Sure, we had the occasional cake in the break room, maybe a few balloons, and once, someone brought in a pinata that accidentally took out a ceiling tile, but disruptive? That seemed like a stretch. Karen continued, "From now on, there will be no more birthday celebrations in the office. No cakes, no decorations, no singing. This is a professional environment, and we need to maintain focus and productivity." The room erupted in a mix of disbelief and laughter. "Wait, are you serious?" someone asked. "No more birthdays? What's next?" No smiling. Karen held up a hand to silence us. "This isn't up for debate. The decision has been made. Birthday celebrations are a distraction, and we can't afford to lose any more time to frivolities." The word frivolities hung in the air like a bad smell. We all exchanged glances, trying to figure out if this was some kind of joke. But Karen's expression told us she was dead serious. She handed out a printed memo outlining the new policy, complete with bullet points and bolded text for emphasis. It was official. Birthdays were now banned. The reaction in the office was immediate and varied. Some people were angry, muttering about how this was just another way for management to suck the joy out of our lives. Others were confused, wondering how a slice of cake and a rousing rendition of Happy Birthday could possibly be seen as a threat to productivity. And then there were those who found the whole thing hilarious, cracking jokes about how we were now living in a dystopian novel where even the slightest hint of happiness was outlawed. One of my co-workers, Dave, decided to test the waters. Dave was the office rebel, the guy who always pushed back against ridiculous rules. The day after the policy was announced, he brought in a cupcake with a single candle and set it on his desk. It was a small act of defiance, but it was enough to get Karen's attention. She marched over to his desk, her heels clicking ominously on the tile floor, and demanded that he remove the cupcake immediately. "Dave, you know the policy," she said, her voice tight with irritation. Dave leaned back in his chair, a smirk on his face. "Karen, it's just a cupcake. It's not like I'm throwing a rave in the break room." Karen wasn't amused. "The policy is clear. No birthday celebrations. That includes cupcakes." Dave shrugged and took a bite of the cupcake, making a show of savoring it. Karen's face turned red, but she didn't say anything else. She just walked away, muttering something about insubordination. The no birthday celebrations policy had an immediate impact on the office atmosphere. It wasn't just about the cake or the singing, it was about the loss of a small but meaningful tradition that brought us together. Birthdays had been a rare bright spot in an otherwise monotonous workweek, a chance to take a break, share a laugh, and feel like we were more than just cogs in a machine. Without them, the office felt colder, more sterile. Even the most cheerful among us started to feel the weight of the new policy. The policy also created some awkward situations. One day, a client happened to be in the office on the same day as a coworker's birthday. The client, unaware of the new policy, brought in a cake to celebrate. Karen was forced to awkwardly explain that we couldn't accept the cake, which led to a very uncomfortable conversation about why we weren't allowed to celebrate birthdays. The client left looking confused and slightly offended, and we were all left feeling embarrassed. But the real turning point came a few months later, when Karen's own birthday rolled around. We all knew it was her birthday because she had mentioned it in passing a few days earlier, probably expecting us to ignore it given the policy. But Dave, ever the instigator, had other plans. He showed up to work that day with a giant, elaborately decorated cake that read, "Happy Birthday, Karen," in bold, colorful letters. He set it up in the break room and sent out an email inviting everyone to come and celebrate. Karen was furious. She stormed into the break room, her face flushed with anger. "Dave, what do you think you're doing? You know the policy." Dave, unfazed, smiled and said, "Karen, it's your birthday. We just wanted to show you how much we appreciate you." The room fell silent as we all waited to see how Karen would respond. For a moment, it looked like she was going to explode. But then, something unexpected happened. She looked at the cake, at the faces of her team, and her expression softened. She let out a sigh and said, "Fine, but this is a one-time exception." We all cheered, and for the first time in months, the office felt alive again. We sang happy birthday, ate cake, and for a brief moment, forgot about the endless spreadsheets and the 12-step printer authentication process. It was a small victory, but it felt significant. The no birthday celebrations policy was never officially revoked, but after Karen's birthday, it was quietly ignored. Cakes started appearing in the break room again, and the occasional happy birthday could be heard echoing down the hallways. Karen never said anything about it, and we all pretended not to notice. Looking back, the whole thing seems absurd. A policy banning birthday celebrations? It's hard to believe that something so trivial could cause so much frustration and tension, but in a way, it was a valuable lesson. It reminded us of the importance of finding joy in the little things, even in the most mundane of environments. It also showed us that sometimes, the best way to deal with ridiculous rules is to challenge them, even if it's just with a cupcake and a smirk. If there's one piece of advice I'd give to anyone dealing with a similarly absurd workplace policy, it's this: don't let it get to you. Find ways to push back, even if it's in small, subtle ways. And most importantly, don't forget to celebrate the things that make life worth living, whether it's a birthday, a promotion, or just making it through another Monday. Because at the end of the day, it's those moments of connection and joy that make the grind of work bearable. And no policy, no matter how ridiculous, should ever take that away. No talking at desks, the office that enforced silence like a library. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind of morning where the coffee tasted like regret and the fluorescent lights hummed a little louder than usual. I was settling into my desk, mentally preparing for another day of spreadsheets and soul-crushing monotony, when my manager, Loretta, clapped her hands sharply. The sound echoed through the open-plan office like a gunshot, and every head swiveled in her direction. Loretta was not a woman who clapped often, so when she did, you knew something was coming. Something bad. "Team," she began, her voice dripping with the kind of faux cheerfulness that made my stomach churn, "we've noticed a decline in productivity lately. After careful consideration, we've decided to implement a new policy to help everyone stay focused." She paused for dramatic effect, her eyes scanning the room like a hawk surveying its prey. "Effective immediately. There will be no talking at your desks. This is a silent workspace." Silence. Not the kind of silence that follows a profound statement, but the kind that hangs in the air like a thick fog, heavy with disbelief. I glanced at my coworker, Jess, who was sitting 2 desks over. Her mouth was hanging open, her eyebrows practically in her hairline. I opened my mouth to say anything, but Loretta cut me off with a sharp, "This includes casual conversation. If you need to discuss work-related matters, please use the designated chat zone by the water cooler." The chat zone. I wish I were making this up. It was a sad little corner of the office, marked by a laminated sign that someone had clearly made in a hurry. The sign featured a clip art image of 2 people shaking hands, accompanied by the words, "Collaboration Station." It was as if the universe had decided to personally insult us. The reasoning behind this policy, as Loretta explained, was to minimize distractions and maximize efficiency. Apparently, someone in upper management had read an article about how open-plan offices were killing productivity, and instead of, reconsidering the open-plan office, they decided to turn the place into a library. A library where the books were replaced by Excel spreadsheets and the librarians were middle managers with a penchant for micromanagement. The reaction from the team was immediate and visceral. Jess, who had never met a rule she didn't want to break, muttered under her breath, What is this, kindergarten? Our other coworker, Dave, who was usually the quietest person in the office, actually laughed out loud. Loretta shot him a look that could have melted steel, and he quickly stifled his laughter, but the damage was done. The tension in the room was palpable. Over the next few days, the office transformed into the most surreal environment I've ever worked in. People tiptoed around like they were in a museum, whispering to each other as if they were sharing state secrets. The chat zone became a bizarre social hub, where co-workers would gather to exchange a few hurried words before scurrying back to their desks like mice avoiding a cat. It was equal parts hilarious and depressing. The policy created a host of awkward situations. One day, I needed to ask Jess a quick question about a project we were working on. Normally, I would have just leaned over and asked her, but under the new rules, that was strictly forbidden. Instead, I had to get up from my desk, walk over to the chat zone, and wait for her to join me. By the time she got there, I had forgotten what I wanted to ask. We stood there in silence for a few seconds before she finally said, "Did you just drag me over here for no reason?" I shrugged, and we both burst out laughing, earning us a stern glare from Loretta. The unintended consequences of the policy were both predictable and absurd. Email traffic skyrocketed as people resorted to typing out messages that could have been resolved with a 30-second conversation. The office became eerily quiet, save for the incessant clacking of keyboards and the occasional sigh of despair. Productivity, far from improving, took a nosedive as people spent more time navigating the ridiculous rules than actually getting work done. The breaking point came about 2 weeks into the policy. Dave, who had been uncharacteristically vocal in his disdain for the new rules, decided to stage a silent protest. He printed out a series of memes mocking the policy and taped them to the wall near the chat zone. One of them featured a picture of a monk with the caption, "Finally, a workplace that understands me." Another showed a group of mimes with the words, "Our new co-workers." It was a small act of rebellion, but in the context of our oppressive new reality, it felt revolutionary. Loretta, of course, was not amused. She stormed over to Dave's desk, her heels clicking ominously against the floor, and demanded that he take the memes down immediately. Dave, to his credit, stood his ground. "Why?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "They're not hurting anyone. In fact, they're boosting morale." Loretta's face turned an alarming shade of red, and for a moment, I thought she might actually explode. Instead, she turned on her heel and marched back to her office, muttering something about insubordination. Loretta looked like she'd been slapped. She stammered something about taking our feedback into consideration and quickly adjourned the meeting. The next day, the policy was quietly rescinded. There was no announcement, no fanfare, just a terse email from Loretta stating that the no talking at desks rule was no longer in effect. It was a small victory, but it felt like we'd won the war. Looking back, the whole experience taught me a valuable lesson about workplace policies and the people who enforce them. Rules, no matter how well-intentioned, can have unintended consequences. They can stifle creativity, breed resentment, and create an environment where people feel more like prisoners than employees. The key is to strike a balance between structure and flexibility, to create a workplace where people feel empowered to do their best work without being micromanaged into oblivion. As for advice, I would say this: if you find yourself working under an absurd policy, don't be afraid to speak up. Challenge the status quo, rally your coworkers, and make your voice heard. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it's a lot harder to ignore a room full of people than it is to ignore one dissenting voice. And if all else fails, print out some memes. Sometimes, humor is the best weapon against absurdity. If you enjoy these corporate cautionary tales, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss our weekly dose of workplace drama. Drop a comment letting us know which story hits closest to home. The mandatory fun policy, when team building became a punishment. It all started on a Tuesday morning, which, in hindsight, should have been the first red flag. Tuesdays are already the most forgettable day of the week, not as bad as Mondays, but still far from the relief of Fridays. Our manager, Greg, called an impromptu team meeting. Greg was the kind of guy who wore khakis year-round and had a habit of saying things like, "Let's circle back on that," even when there was nothing to circle back on. He stood at the front of the room, clutching a stack of papers like they were the Dead Sea Scrolls, and announced with the gravitas of a man unveiling a new constitution, "We're implementing a mandatory fun policy." At first, we thought it was a joke. Greg had a dry sense of humor, and we'd all been victims of his April Fool's prank the year before, where he'd sent out a fake memo about switching to a 4-day workweek. Spoiler, it was not a 4-day workweek, but as he began to read from the papers in his hands, it became painfully clear that this was no joke. The Mandatory Fund Policy, or MFP as it was quickly dubbed, required every employee to participate in at least one team-building activity per week. These activities ranged from trust falls and scavenger hunts to karaoke nights and, inexplicably, a company-wide talent show. Attendance was mandatory, and failure to participate would result in a formal write-up. The reasoning, according to Greg, was to boost morale, foster camaraderie, and increase productivity. Because nothing says productivity like belting out Bohemian Rhapsody in front of your boss. The room was silent for a solid 10 seconds after Greg finished speaking. Then, like a dam breaking, the questions started flying. What if I have other commitments? Someone asked. Greg smiled tightly and said, this is a priority. Another person asked, what if I'm not comfortable singing or doing trust falls? Greg's response, stepping out of your comfort zone is part of the process. I raised my hand and asked, is this policy going to be applied to upper management as well? Greg hesitated for a moment before saying, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Translation: no. The reactions among my co-workers were a mixed bag. Some people were amused, treating the whole thing like a bizarre social experiment. Others were visibly angry, muttering under their breath about how this was a waste of time. A few, like my desk neighbor Karen, seemed genuinely excited. Karen was the kind of person who brought homemade cupcakes to the office on her birthday and had a collection of novelty mugs that said things like teamwork makes the dream work. She clapped her hands together and said, this is going to be so much fun. The rest of us just stared at her like she'd grown a second head. The first week of the mandatory fund policy was, in a word, awkward. Our assigned activity was a trust fall exercise in the parking lot. Yes, the parking lot. Because nothing says team building like catching your coworker as they plummet toward asphalt. Greg had enlisted the help of an outside consultant, a woman named Brenda who wore a fanny pack and referred to herself as a fun facilitator. Brenda had us form a circle and take turns falling backward into each other's arms. It was as uncomfortable as it sounds. Half of us were too nervous to fully commit to the fall, resulting in a series of awkward stumbles and near misses. The other half, like Karen, threw themselves backward with reckless abandon, almost taking out a few people in the process. By the end of it, we were all sweaty, irritated, and no closer to fostering camaraderie than we had been before. The following week was karaoke night. This was, without a doubt, the low point of the mandatory fund policy. Greg had rented a karaoke machine and set it up in the break room, which was already too small for our team of 30. The room was hot, the acoustics were terrible, and the song selection was limited to early 2000s pop hits and Disney classics. Karen, of course, was the first to grab the microphone. She belted out a rendition of Let It Go from Frozen that was equal parts impressive and terrifying. The rest of us sat in uncomfortable silence, sipping lukewarm coffee and wondering where it had all gone wrong. When it was my turn, I half-heartedly mumbled my way through Since You Been Gone by Kelly Clarkson, which earned me a pity round of applause and a sympathetic pat on the back from Karen. As the weeks went on, the mandatory fund policy became less about fun and more about survival. People started finding creative ways to avoid the activities, like suddenly remembering they had a dentist appointment or claiming they were swamped with work. Greg, however, was relentless. He started sending out reminder emails with subject lines like "Don't forget, fun is mandatory and team building equals to success." He even created a leaderboard to track participation, which only added to the resentment. Karen, unsurprisingly, was at the top of the leaderboard, while the rest of us languished somewhere near the bottom. The breaking point came during the company-wide talent show. Greg had decided that this would be the pièce de résistance of the mandatory fund policy, a chance for us to showcase our unique talents and bond as a team. The problem was, most of us didn't have any talents that were appropriate for a workplace setting. Karen, of course, signed up immediately, promising a surprise performance that none of us were looking forward to. I, on the other hand, was coerced into participating by Greg, who cornered me in the break room and said, "Come on, it'll be fun." Spoiler, it was not fun. The talent show was held in the conference room, which had been decorated with streamers and balloons in a sad attempt to make it feel festive. Karen's surprise performance turned out to be an interpretive dance to Celine Dion's My Heart Will Go On. It was exactly as cringe-worthy as it sounds. When it was my turn, I stood in front of the room and attempted to do a card trick that I'd learned from a YouTube tutorial the night before. It went about as well as you'd expect. Halfway through the trick, I dropped the deck of cards, sending them scattering across the floor. As I knelt down to pick them up, I heard someone in the back of the room mutter, "This is the worst thing that's ever happened to me." I couldn't help but agree. The turning point came a few weeks later, when Greg announced that we would be doing a team-building retreat at a local ropes course. This was, by far, the most ambitious and most dangerous activity yet. The ropes course was located in a nearby forest and featured a series of high-altitude obstacles, including a zip line and a wobbly bridge. Greg framed it as an opportunity to challenge ourselves and build trust, but most of us saw it for what it was, a lawsuit waiting to happen. The day of the retreat was a disaster from start to finish. It was raining, the ropes were slippery, and no one was in the mood to be there. Karen, ever the optimist, tried to rally the group by shouting, "We've got this, team," but her enthusiasm was met with stony silence. Was the beginning of the end for the mandatory fun policy. A few days after the retreat, Greg called another team meeting. This time, he didn't have any papers in his hands. He looked tired, defeated even, as he announced that the mandatory fun policy was being re-evaluated. He didn't give a reason, but we all knew it was because of the ropes course incident. The room erupted in cheers, which only made Greg look more dejected. Karen, ever the loyal soldier, tried to defend the policy, saying, "I think it brought us closer together," but she was quickly drowned out by a chorus of groans. Looking back, the mandatory fun policy was a lesson in how not to manage a team. It taught me that forcing people to have fun is a surefire way to make them miserable. It also taught me that sometimes, the best way to build camaraderie is to just let people do their jobs and go home. My advice to anyone dealing with a similarly absurd workplace policy is simple: speak up, challenge it, and if all else fails, just remember that it's not forever. Eventually, even the most ridiculous policies come to an end, usually in a muddy puddle at a ropes course.